It's inauguration day today as Joe Biden becomes the 46th president. I talk about that with my guest and good friend Dan Basco. We also discuss social media and where we see society going. I'm Josh Binner, and this is the Today's Faith Matters podcast.
Dan, it's so wonderful to have you with me. It's so great to see you today, and just look forward to this conversation with you. And as we begin, your passion is missions and serving abroad, and I'd love to have you just talk about that for a moment.
Absolutely. So when Josh and I met, we were both students in seminary at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, also known as TEDS. And I say that in past tense, but it's still a reality for me that I'm very much passionate about missions, global missions. And I was a student at TEDS because I felt God calling me to the country and people of Japan. And, currently, full disclosures, I'm not professionally employed in ministry. I was right after TEDS, after I graduated, but God kind of took me a long route, and I worked in a church. It wasn't too healthy, but I think it was that passion and zeal for what God is doing, not just locally, but globally, that helped me endure through a very painful season in ministry. And even when I resigned and I was looking for redirection and God's possible redirection. And I think that the how of missions has changed, but, really thinking about how good and glorious God is and being influenced in large part by what I see as a biblical theology of mission, and how God is constantly on expanding his dwelling place to get at the language of Beale. And if you talk to me long enough, I'll throw down some Beale, because I really like his scholarship. I think he put some very good arguments, and I like that framework that he has for thinking about space and the space that God inhabits, especially us, his people, the church. And that's such a beautiful picture that's not just a thing to think about, but a reality to inhabit as he dwells in us and among us. So anyway, that's getting a little bit into the weeds, but that passion and zeal has not really died, but the how, and how do you engage missions as our world is drastically changing and quickly changing, as we're going to be getting into in a little bit, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should mention for anybody who's watching or listening, we're recording this on Monday, a couple of days before the inauguration for Joe Biden. And Dan, to me, is such a multifaceted Renaissance man as far as your knowledge of missions, history, anthropology. And I think that's part of the reason why you and I always have such interesting conversations, is I think we just are both very curious about a lot of the topics and subjects that kind of trying to explain why the world is the way that it is.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think that, that is the challenge for us in our day and age, because I think one of the things that social media in particular does to us is it makes information so quick for us to access, but it makes it harder for us to digest in a deep thinking sort of way. So it's harder for us to actually reflect, and it's easier for us to react. And in fact, that's a whole genre within the social media, YouTube type space. It's a whole genre. You can make your whole living off of reacting to things and giving your hot take. And I think that there's a time and a place for a reaction, but there's also a time and a place for reflection. And that's what I enjoy about our friendship.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an interesting observation unto itself, how just I feel like we were very reactionary as a society. I feel like we more and more rely on our preconceived ideas and notions to label and to judge and to prejudge. And, it's interesting. I hear a lot of talk about echo chambers, and I hear that from both sides, but I feel like anybody is capable of creating their own echo chamber. And I think of that right now, specifically as I think about politics. And just, I think part of the divisiveness in our country is it's never probably been easier to really just have access to what you want to know and to ignore what you choose to ignore.
Right. And I think that's one of our great dangers, and I'm definitely prone to it. I think part of that, if we want to get into the nitty gritty, is, and I don't want to just remove our own agency from making and the fact that we actually make choices, but we also have to understand that we live in a context. And in our day and age, a lot of what we do requires being online. And just the very nature of how visual media stimulus works upon your brain, especially if there's a like button right next to it, it's creating a physiological response in your brain, a biological response that says yes, good. So you're actually dropping hormones when you post something and you get a like, or you see engagement along the lines of something that you are predisposed to agree with already. So it makes you feel good when you engage media that you like or you agree with. Your initial reaction to something you disagree with, that's like an unpleasant feeling because you could be wrong. The things that you're passionate about or you feel so entrenched upon, that could be, you very well could be wrong, or it's just something unpleasant to face, a reality or an argument that you just drastically disagree with. And so it's easier to go with the flow, so the saying goes. And so even your brain is being hardwired to escape argument, even though in some ways it just increases argument. But now we're getting into a little bit of the specifics, but that's just to say that this is not just a matter of coaching someone how to think or how to have more of a liberal arts approach to thinking. In other words, being free to think, taking more of probably the Greek trivium approach to knowledge. You learn your grammar, you learn your syntax, then you have your rhetoric, or you learn an argument, the basics, the foundation. So you just memorize everything. Then you move on to making the different people within that body of knowledge talk back to each other. Then you have a voice. Then you're able to say, these are what everyone has said. And I agree with this part. I disagree with that part. But now I'm going to offer some insight with some new information. So you could say it's kind of like your bachelor, master's, PhD level style of education. But now it's just, I'm already at the PhD level. I want to have my input. Here's my voice. And into that giant cacophony, it's harder and harder to have any authorities as to what's actually a sound argument or what's not, because now we're just, we're just appealing to authority, which is a logical fallacy in and of itself. And I've just meandered all over the place, but I think that just gives a weird general lay of the land for how quickly our world has changed as far as the landscape of ideas. Universities are no longer a guarantor of what is good information, when a good majority of folks are getting their information from other medias or mediums. Same thing with what's called the legacy media, your print newspapers or your primetime television news anchors. Now you have cable, now you have YouTube, now you have Snapchat, now you have TikTok, you have Instagram. And all of these are vying for your attention, and they're all saying, this is what you should value, what you should love, what you should worship, what you should fear, and what you should believe.
Yeah, absolutely. That's all very interesting, and certainly a change in just the dynamics of our society and how we consume media. And there's been a lot of change. It's interesting, just everything as a world we've been through. I mean, just in the past 12 months, not just politically, but from COVID and issues of social issues that we've faced. And it just, as a society, like we've just been beaten up in the past year. And so I guess one of the first questions I'd be curious to ask is, with everything that we've gone through, looking forward as we start a new administration, and not even politically as far as what we agree or disagree with on a certain politician, but just the way the society is going, do you feel like you're more optimistic or pessimistic stepping into 2021?
Okay, so this is probably one of my character faults. On the one hand, as a believer in Jesus Christ, I believe that we should always be optimistic in the sense that, and I am hopeful, and I perhaps that's the better distinguishing way, or way to distinguish between optimism and hope, because somehow, the inner pessimist in me will say like blind optimism is just forcing yourself to see differently when there's a reality to be dealt with. And maybe you're just naive and you're willfully naive. But again, that's the pessimist in me. But I think as a Christian, you say, this is not the way things ought to be. There's an oughtness to the world that has been inaugurated in the rule and reign of Jesus Christ and is yet to be consummated. And it gets at that present progressive, I believe it's present active progressive, or present, it's an active tense in I am making all things new. It's a continuing thing. It's something that has begun and that is reaching its culmination. We don't know when, because, the Father doesn't even tell the Son, to use that hyperbolic language from the New Testament. But we know the season. And in that sense, you can tell that there's a season approaching in which more and more creation is groaning for its creator to consummate his rule and reign. And that's something to be very hopeful about. But I think even generally just, I don't want to get into too much eschatology here because that can get quickly heated because people have different stances on where they land on their end time theology. But I think part of that, it's just agreeable to say that God is doing amazing and wonderful things. Be hopeful about that, but also be a realistic person, because at the same time, the devil is going to ramp up his resistance to whatever God's doing in the world. That's amazing and beautiful. So I think that's where I'm hopeful, but I'm also a realist that, the United States is not coterminous with the kingdom of God, his rule and reign. I have some preferences for where I land on economic philosophy and, judicial philosophy and whatnot. Everyone has an opinion these days. Why can't I have one? But those things are not, in the grand scheme of things, as important as the rule and reign of Jesus Christ. And in that sense, I can be a realist. I can be disappointed about certain things in my context, but I can be very hopeful that in the grander story of what God is doing, that his rule and reign will be consummated.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that perspective. And I put it how there should be this idea of hopefulness and what is going on. And ultimately, God is going to do everything to his own glory and for his own glory. And that doesn't mean that everything's going to be pleasant along the way. And so, these are interesting times that we're living in.
Well, yeah. Part of being a realist is not sugarcoating certain things that I think are very deeply disturbing, with leaving kind of the whole Republican, Democrat, liberal, progressive to libertarian to conservative conversation aside. I think that just looking at the larger scope of human history, the amount of debt that we're running compared to our GDP is no country has ever survived. No nation or empire has ever survived, historically speaking, running such great debts or overextending itself as far as its influence in a geographic sense. I believe the fall of the Roman Empire was predicated by its overexpansion and its lack of attention to its interior. And then how, as we see quite kind of happening with a lot of countries within the EU to the US, you see quite a divide between your urban dwellers and your periphery or more of your country. And when your tax policy outpaces what your agrarian society is able to actually pay, that's kind of a recipe for disaster, because all empires run on actual food. And, if you're paying attention to environmental stuff, whether you disagree or agree with global change or global warming or whatnot, it is somewhat, I think everyone can agree that you need water to grow things. And when you pay attention to geopolitical conflicts, such as between India and China, and the Kashmir Valley, Pakistan and India, and kind of all over, even what's happening here now that I've moved to California, I'm more aware of water issues. But, the majority of, I believe, the US's crops grow in California, and yet it's taking in water from, I believe, Nevada. Sorry, I have to pronounce that correctly for my Nevada friends, um, and Utah, and that's disconcerting because you have the coastal regions who are distancing themselves from the interior, and so what does that mean as people begin to move towards where they would like to live ideologically, but also with regard to policy? And that really makes for interesting conversations about 21st century balkanization in the United States. So
Yeah,
anyway,
I think
we
that's
went all over the world.
Yeah. No, you're good. I think that's very interesting. That's something my wife talks about a lot. She has a degree in history too. As far as one of the things that does interest her a lot about just what we're going through right now, especially with COVID, I think is what sparked this thought is the long-term changes that we don't even necessarily know about today, that 5 years, 10 years down the road, 50 years down the road, that we'll look back on, and then our children and grandchildren will look back on and see the line that COVID, I feel like if you watch the history of like anything, it's like World War II is like this like BC AD type of event where like everything changed. Now, I'm not saying COVID is that monumental, but where I think you do have long-term changes. And one of the things I was reading an article yesterday talking about where people live, and certainly there are certain areas that people are moving out of. And it was interesting because the article is also bringing up that more and more jobs have become remote over the past year. And some of these jobs are going to stay remote. And so you're going to have people who don't have to necessarily live in a certain area. Obviously, live in California, where it costs about $1 billion to live anywhere. That you might have people who, I think even living in Illinois, Illinois is an expensive state to live in. I live in a small town. That you might have people from larger cities where it is very expensive, where taxes tend to be high, where a lot of times there is a higher crime rate in rural areas. I'm not saying that everyone's just going to leave every major city, but that you might have noticeable shifts of people leaving for more rural areas where it's just cheaper to live.
Yes, and there's a lot of different factors involved. Even when we were students back in Illinois, I believe at the time there was some interesting studies and folks watching the population changes of California, New York, and Illinois, mostly because of the policies of the larger cities setting policy for the state. And what they were observing is that the states were dying by way of population. And they were moving, these people, as they were tracking them, they were moving to predominantly Texas and Virginia at the time. And that's because not so much Virginia by policy anymore, since it flipped pretty much a strong blue. Again, this is just descriptive. I'm not kind of making a comment here, but a lot of, for example, there are as many Fortune 500 companies now in the Austin area in Texas as a whole as there are in California. And that has to do a lot with the business-friendly laws. And I think that's only accelerated a trend. COVID-19 has only accelerated that trend. Let's put it this way. If your cost of living is somewhere between, and this is just for rent, and this is true in the Santa Barbara area where I now live, if your cost of living is somewhere around 40% of your paycheck, and that's just your rent. If you don't have a job that actually is secure, and that by that I mean you actually are paid through the whole thing, you're actually working, whether remotely or on site, and if that company does not have the infrastructure or is in a type of industry that is deemed necessary, again, depending on which state and where you live, how close to a city and whatnot, your business that you worked for may have gone belly up. That's permanent job loss. That job may never be coming back, even though you yourself have the capability of working. So what are you going to do if $600, or now it's $1,200 if you count more or less the full calendar year, or to the extent that COVID-19 has been going on in the United States, you got $1,200 back from the federal government. And yet that's kind of disturbing at the same time, because, and now I'm bleeding into some other very disturbing things. When was it the Federal Reserve, or sorry, our mints just printed probably close to 65, more than 65% of all US dollars in the past 10, 12 months.
Yeah.
That's in all US history. That's how much
Yeah,
money we printed.
which is, I mean, that's almost impossible to wrap your mind around.
Right. And I'm not calling, pre Hitler Germany as far as the amount of debt, because of the treaties, the very punitive treaties that the French and the British really levied upon the Germans after World War One. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying we're not going to necessarily be shoveling, dollars into wheelbarrows to go buy a loaf of bread from your local grocery store. I think that's a bit of an alarming thing. But if you think about the comparison of living in a place like California or in New York, where you have very high taxes, compared to, let's say, a Wyoming or an Idaho, it's very friendly and there's a lot more open space. There's a reason why the homesteading movement has suddenly taken off in the past year, and a lot of people are moving to the Idaho River Basin. Natural resources, it's relatively open, and there's a lot of leave me alone type open property, and a government that generally leans in that direction. So I do think that there's a overall balkanization, if you will, of different regions within America, and it's away from cities. And yet at the same time, folks are leaving, but their values haven't changed. So it's interesting what will happen. And my prediction is that we're going to be headed into an interesting time politically, in which larger cities and suburbs are going to be dominating policy, whereas there's going to be an increasing number of people who are going to feel alienated from decision making, who are left more in the periphery, which has never boded well for any empire when you divorce the unit, or you have the schisming of the people between, when you have consider your agricultural base and then your city and your mercantile classes.
I think in places where I've lived, also I was trying to do the math, and you were talking about the percentage of income that housing costs. I think in the small town we live in Illinois, it's like 15%.
Yeah, yeah, it
Which is
breaks
just
my heart.
insane. I'm sure I can't. I think in the church where I serve, if we'd gotten called to a larger city, I mean, obviously California is exceptionally expensive, but I mean, I think even of my hometown of Columbus, Ohio, and that's considered to be one of the most affordable major cities in America. It's still expensive to buy a house.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it's still hundreds of thousands of dollars. But it's interesting what you said about how this sort of disconnect between like a major city, and obviously Chicago in Illinois is a prime example of it. Kind of dominates the rest of the state. And I live a couple hours south of Chicago. I don't think there's really a whole lot of affinity for Chicago in the area. But I also think of when I lived in Minnesota, a town about 2.5 hours outside of the Twin Cities. And again, Minnesota is similar, where Minneapolis, St. Paul really kind of directs a lot of the rest of the state. And I think about where we were. We were an hour from Fargo, North Dakota, Fargo, as the locals call it. And I feel like up there, they had a lot more in common, just in terms of the cultural mindset and sensibilities, far more in common with Fargo than they did with Minneapolis, St. Paul. And it's almost like it's not even the same state.
Right. And I grew up outside of Washington, D.C. And my parents, for example, they commuted their whole lives, more or less, into Washington, D.C. My dad, before he retired, he worked very close to the White House. He would walk by it, Lafayette Park, and he'd walk DuPont Circle quite often. And that was life growing up in Northern Virginia. But if you go, at the time I was growing up, before I left for college, if you went to Fredericksburg, If for your Civil War buffs, the Battle of Fredericksburg, it's just down the road. If you go down there at the time, you were in rural Virginia. There's a whole different perspective. You hear the Virginia Southern accent. The food is quite different. And you know that you're in the middle of a forest. It's wooded. There's, when it's dark, but not anymore. That Northern Virginia has spread out. And if you talk to people outside of Northern Virginia and you say, I'm from Northern Virginia, they would most likely tell you, you're not a real Virginian, because there's a whole cultural attitude and way of being in the world that's different from that very metropolitan, cosmopolitan, very politically savvy, my local news is the national news type mentality that a lot of Northern Virginians have. Yeah. And so I'm one of the rarities because I was born and raised in Northern Virginia. And for a time I moved back there. And when I went back there for a few years, most of the people who had moved there were not native Virginians. You'd be hard pressed to find at least one person who's actually from that area. Most of everyone who was local had been pushed out of Northern Virginia because of the increased cost of living.
Yeah, that is. So there's just this great sort of shuffling around that we have in the country.
Right. And I think, all you have to do is look at the past 3 or 4 electoral college maps from our general election, and you will literally see what is the real functional divide in America. It's deeply red in every place that it's a periphery to a major city, and deeply blue wherever it is. There's a city, or in a major suburb feeding into that city. So again, it's not to say good thing or bad thing, but it is, I think, this generally descriptive reality. Yeah, I think I've played my hand a little bit. I mean, I'm a Keynesian by economic philosophy. Not Keynesian. I am decidedly Austrian in my. I'm not a fan of Keynes, but I was taught Keynesian economic theory when I was in high school. He was kind of like the big wig, But anyway, we're not going to go there.
Sounds good. So with all of this moving around and all of this discontinuity between the major cities that can dominate the rest of a state, I think you touched on this a moment ago, but do you see that societally as being problematic for the American system?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things to keep track of here. One is a geographic divide. People are moving, and we see that. And again, I'd like to point folks toward the homesteading movement. That's really just taken off in the past 10 years. And what that is a general distrust or dissatisfaction with the way that overall governance is moving. People want to feel free at the very least, or they want to own all the means of production as far as actual goods and services. And maybe they just are disenchanted with the vision of the good life, the techno-global, media saturated good life. And I think there's good reasons for that, some very admirable reasons for that. So there's that geographic divide. But I'd also like to point out that there is also a digital space divide. And we can comment upon Parler and how AWS, Amazon Wireless Services, pulled their service from them to the Apple Store, the App Store, pulling Parler off, as well as the Google Play Store. But that, I think, is just indicative of digital space. And whether you believe, under Section 230 is functioning as a utility versus a publisher, if we want to go in that direction, whatnot, I think that just for purely descriptive reasons, we have to understand that people are aligning themselves in different communities. They're balkanizing in different areas of the internet. And so we have to think about where we get information from and how it's really shaping our communities. Because by and large, the definition of a good neighbor has changed. And I'm really borrowing this thing from someone else, that they noted that the good neighbor in the early 1990s was the person you knock on their front door at, any evening and say, hey, I need a cup of sugar, and delighted to give you a cup of sugar or a cup of flour. These days, a good neighbor is someone you don't know and minds their own business. And at least in the major suburbs of a big metropolitan city, who wants to know their neighbor? And increasingly, and again, I think this goes to what I said about tweets and social media. If your brain is hardwired to only go in the direction of news or media that will, agree with your own preconceived notions or sentiments, the same applies essentially to your physical relationships. So you may be quiet among people you disagree with, and then you might tweet about a storm, or you might post to your friends, your real friends, but you're physically present with other people. And that's just an interesting thing to think about as Christians, that you could be physically present, but mentally or fully present somewhere else. And you're somehow, they used to say, in the pre-modern era, you lived where you worked, where you worshiped. So that was your community. You lived in a village, you worked there, went to church there, you died there, you got married there. But with technological change, you didn't necessarily live where you worked, where you worshiped. So then we had the problem of city or suburb churches where, you could be three different people. You're at-home person, the person you are at church, and the person you are at work. And add in the digital, that fourth dimension into it. And you could be not present anywhere, but fully immerse yourself with that secret self, posting pseudo-anonymously. So I think we have to understand that we have to add this weird quasi-Gnostic layer of geography or spatial community in there. And there's a reason I want to go there. And I'm sorry for hogging the mic here, but
that's fascinating.
The reason I want to bring this up is because Benedict Anderson, if I remember the author's name correctly, he wrote a book I think 1 or 2 decades back. It's called Imagined Communities. And his thesis generally was that you didn't have the modern nation state emerge until you had print capitalism. So his argument goes something like this. For example, before Germany was Germany, you had the Germanic states and Germanic kingdoms who were kind of fighting it all out. Then Gutenberg comes along, and then he has the printing press. What does he print? He prints the Bible. But beyond just the religious aspect, one of the things that Gutenberg's Bible does is it standardizes German. Beforehand, all you had were these villages, Germanic villages, where you lived, where you worked, you worshipped. If some large invading force was coming over, a Germanic prince or king would say, hey, I'm gathering everyone up. You've never seen him before in your life, but you know his standard. And you're like, oh, okay, well, if I don't fight, I guess I'll die or starve. So then you go to fight. And that's really your whole community, is what someone tells you of maybe the next village, but your community is conceptually just what you conceive of in your reality. But the moment you have something that can be printed and mass printed, and you can standardize the language, then you can know, oh, that village over the hill, over there, they're Germans too. And what you do see is the rise of proto-German nationalism happening at the same time that the printing press is really starting to catch on. And so Anderson kind of like, he says like this takes off like wildfire. And now you can bridge large geographic distances with a common shaping narrative. Now he doesn't just say print capitalism is the only thing, but it's key. Now let's just fast forward a little bit now that we have digital media always on all the time. And it's not just print, it's video, it's audio through someone else's lens. And that puts the emotions right up in your face all the time. So the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, who we belong to, what we ought to love, and the way things ought to be are not really controlled by the librarian or whatever school of thought you espouse to, from whoever taught you political history in your liberal arts college or your gen eds. It's now all these different voices. And so you see the fracturing of those larger communities perhaps. So it's like the Wild West of community, of imagined community. So I'm just taking Benedict Anderson's work and I'm just trying to run with it a little bit. But that, I think, is a scary thought, but I think it's also an opportunity as Christians to think about what ought to be the story that unites all Christians at all times in all spaces. And can that ring truer and be more real than the, I believe it was C.S. Lewis, it was one of those British guys, or G.K. Chesterton, who said, like, the problem is the newspaper. It's always in my face. It's bringing all the world's hurts and worries right up here. And that's closer to me than God. And I'm really butchering kind of the anecdote, but that's so much more true in our media and I would say infested landscape. So what's going to bring us as one, as the people of God, the story of Scripture? Or is it going to be all the different subliminal messages of the way the world ought to be through our eyes and the affections that they impress upon us?
That was brilliant. Thank you. That's a lot to think about, and yeah, that is such a rich analysis. I don't know where to begin. I'll kind of begin with the end of that, where you're talking about faith communities, and to turn it a slightly different direction. This is something that I've thought a lot about lately. And again, we already touched on this, but the intense political divide that exists in our nation. And I see so many Christians who, and I feel like people do it on both sides, where they want to demonize anybody who identifies as a Christian who's on the other side politically. Oh, many people go into the extreme of saying that if somebody disagrees, that they can't even be a Christian. They're not even in the kingdom. So we almost elevate it to a gospel issue. See, I thought we were justified by faith alone. Some people, when I say no, we're justified by faith and believing that, this sort of political legalism almost. And again, I think both parties can be guilty of it, because I'm a big believer that John Calvin was right when he talked about the human heart being a factory of idols. I think both sides can be guilty of creating idols of their own party. And I actually think both sides, I'm not saying every American citizen who has a political opinion does this, but I think there are people within both parties who either elevate their party or certain individuals within their party to an almost cultish status. I think he gets talked a lot about lately with President or former President Trump, which is a problem. And I think, that it's one thing if we like things that he does or has done. He's not God. He's not a political messiah. He's not our savior. But again, I think the same thing happens on the other side, where people put all their hopes in, progressivism. And I think we can make religions of both parties.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to me, and I'll tie this into social media again. We kind of lived in this weird heyday of my private life is mine. Social media has essentially ended that, because where I mentioned, in the modern era, you could live where you work, where you worship, where you didn't have to. You could be three different people.
Can I give you an example?
Yeah.
Sorry to cut you off.
No, go for it.
So, because I'm a couple years older than you, and so like when I was a freshman in college, like that's when we got Facebook. Like it was the Facebook still at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember some of the different changes that Facebook made, because Facebook, when it started, was very different than what it looks like today. It was obviously just for college students. You had one profile picture. You could put your class schedule up there, because it was like your network was your college. You didn't share videos. You didn't really share statuses. there wasn't even messaging at the time. Like, it was very simplistic compared to, actually, there was messaging, but it was very simplistic in comparison to what it became. But I remember as the different changes came up on Facebook, and like the home page on Facebook used to basically be a picture of your own profile picture. And if you had any messages or if there were any friends' birthdays, it would show you that. But that was pretty much it. And then I think it was probably a couple years later, like around 06, where they added the news feed, and where they were taking information that people had posted on their own Facebooks and putting that all, and it was like creepy. It was like some sort of like Orwellian, like, but now it's just, we didn't care.
Right. So I don't even know what the original question was. There's so much to comment on. But yes, I agree with you.
Political idolatry, and then you would sort of
political
circle us back to social media.
Yes, I know where I'm going with it now. Yeah, I actually came in on the tail end. My freshman year of college, I was on the tail end of Facebook being exclusively for college students. So I remember that. And in addition to that, my college had very shoddy internet. Its internet was better than the internet. So, we were forced to really just, in the middle of a Chicago winter, you interact with people. You don't interact with what they posted. And really, it wasn't until 06, what was it, 08 was, 08 was when the iPhone came out. And that's when Facebook became an application. So it wasn't no longer just the, laptop or the desktop where was your portal. Now it was a smartphone and went with you everywhere. And I think the reason I want to point that out, and I give full credit to my friend Anthony Buck, another fellow TED student, when he and I talked, he said, one of the things that social media has done is it has reintroduced to the Western world an increased level of shame that it otherwise didn't have. I mean, there's shameful things regardless of whatever culture you're in.
Sure.
For example, back in the 90s growing up, and, like true love waits and whatnot, if you're in an evangelical circle, there was like, or you got to have your WWJD bracelet, or you're not in the in crowd, right? It has to be the official brand. We had these little things of shame. There was always like a few cultural sins that were worse than others. And I think social media, shame works when you have a community. That shame honor function really comes to the surface when your lives are intermeshed like this. If you don't have to work where you live, where you worship, and you can shut the door on community, being in your business and being in your life, there's no shame. You can do whatever you want in secret. But if social media and the way that we communicate is suddenly on all the time, people may not be physically present, but you feel their presence. Should I post this? There was much talk about the hidden Trump voter, or the silent Trump voter, or the silent majority, people who are too afraid to speak up and like actually be vocal and go to a rally or whatnot. I think that kind of betrays what has happened to us socially and culturally. We have such a high level of shame and honor now that we haven't known in the past. And what I mean by that, why that's important to your question about religious idolatry on both sides, is because in shame and honor, it's about breaking relationships, being in right relationship. Shame is essentially at the heart of it, not being in right relationship with someone. Honor is being held in high esteem by relationship. It's not a legal, are you right or are you wrong? And I think a lot of us Christians, the way that we're taught to think about, for example, our theology of salvation is forensic. It's through that legal mindset. Am I justified or am I not justified? But there's very much a shame, honor. Am I in right relationship with my Lord and Savior, or am I not in right relationship? And that gets deeply to, that you offend God with your sin. He's a holy God, and you've offended him by your sin. And that's, the necessary reaction is wrath and judgment. And of course, there's the legal aspect there, there's that forensic aspect. But I think we kind of downplay that because we kind of sit uneasily with that. But I think now's the time to really talk about restoration of relationship, of communion with our Lord. Because if you think about, to your point, these almost religious purity tests, that's very much a shame honor question on both sides. Am I in right relationship with these people? And therefore, you probably have a good number of folks who may have a nuanced view or be more willing to say like, hey, I agree with that policy, but not this one. And I just have a different hierarchy of ethics. I agree that this issue is a right or wrong issue, but this party may have more of the ethical issue that weighs most upon my heart before the Lord. And we can't really have those conversations anymore because we feel the weight of shame or the potential of it. At least that's my take on it.
Yeah, I agree. And that's something, if we have time, it's something I've wondered about before. And again, I think you know more about sociology and anthropology than I do. It's something I've wondered about before, though, if American society, in part because of social media, could actually transition more to an honor shame culture, which I would argue, in the past, again, obviously concepts of honor and shame exist in America, but if it's something that can become more pronounced just in our society. But before we get to that, there is something that it's interesting that you keep talking about, worshiping where we work, where we live, because I think of times where I've lived in suburban areas and churches I've gone to in suburbs, and it's like people live everywhere but close to the church. It's like people live 20 minutes in every conceivable direction away from undoubtedly passing fine churches on the way to that church. But it's just interesting that people intentionally pick churches that are not close to where they live. I'm not saying everybody does that, but I've asked just anecdotally pastors that question before in suburban areas, and typically it's a significant majority of the people who go to that church do not live within 5 to 10 minutes of the church. And I think about where I live now in a rural area where almost everybody does live within 10 minutes of the church. And it's interesting because one thing I've thought about before is I think it can be really easy, especially for somebody who lives in a city, to idealize a small town church thinking, oh, well, they must all just be like a big family. And look, we love each other. But I think that's happened at every church that I've either worshiped at or pastored at, that people care about each other. But in some ways, it's interesting because as far as like openness and vulnerability, in some ways, I think it can actually be easier in the suburban church because you have people who they don't work together, they didn't grow up together, their families don't know each other, and so I think it can actually be easier to be open and vulnerable with that person than at a small town where so many families, most people who live here are from here, like they all have history, and I think there can be a real hesitance. And again, I think this is true in general of small towns. I'm not criticizing my church because, again, I love the people. But I think there can be a tendency in a smaller town to almost be more guarded.
Yeah. And I'm not doubting that. In fact, I'd say you're right on the money. And because you have more deeply rooted relationships. If, for example, let's just take negative accountability, because there's positive accountability, and what I mean by that is someone saying like, hey, like, good job, in the sense like, hey, I saw you like go from here in your walk with the Lord to here, and that's an accountability of a kind that says, hey, I'm positively reinforcing godliness. But there's also negative, and this is not a bad thing, so don't misread it, but there's things where someone needs to say like, hey, brother, I was hurt, that was a sin, and as a fellow brother or sister in the Lord, they have every right to say, I was sinned against, and there needs to be reconciliation. But that can be a little bit hard if your roots are so deep, and if the sin is so heinous or the wounding is so deep in the relationship, those things can get easily glossed over because you don't want to rock the boat, or you don't want to bring shame, or you don't want to, excommunicate someone. You remove someone from communion, or you remove someone from community, especially in a smaller church. And I think perhaps one of the reasons why it can on the surface appear that folks who are in metropolitan areas, whether it's the suburb or the city, are so willing to be vulnerable is because of the lack of deep relationship. A lot of people, especially at the time that we were in school, there was all the cities are the next big thing. Everyone, over half the world's population is going to be living in a city by 2050. Maybe that'll be true still. After coronavirus, who knows? But I think there's that quick jump to relationship because of how transient people are. But I think it's just symptomatic of where people are coming from. But it also has its dangers too. And the analogy, one of the pastors who mentored me said it's in community, just like in marriage, there's an appropriate season for intimacy relationally. And, in the right type of marriage relationship between a man and a woman, you take off the clothes at the right time. And it was a little crass, but he was talking to a bunch of college students from a Christian school. So I think it was the right audience for that. Because where I went to in a Christian school, we would talk about, be careful about being too emotionally and spiritually intimate with someone too quickly. Just because you come from a Christian background and she comes from a Christian background, you might be like, oh my gosh, you've been praying for a spouse, I've been praying for the spouse, but we're just friends, And next thing you know, there's just, you go end up talking late into the night because of study session, and you become emotionally intimate too quickly. And then one person has expectations of the relationship, the other didn't. So that's the context in which that was shared. But I think that's kind of a good diagnosis that, at least the lens that I view a lot of suburban churches or any community in which you have people who are highly transient suddenly landing into physical space with each other. There's a longing for intimacy. And I think that just tells us we're human.
Yeah. And that's interesting. That's something that, in general, I think there's a epidemic of loneliness, which I think predates coronavirus in our society. And, it's something that I'm still skeptical, from everything I've read, interactions on social media. I met my wife online. You met your wife online too, right?
Yeah, by your recommendation.
So, obviously, yeah. I was 99% sure you met her online. So obviously, we've interacted with people digitally, and you can form, I have no doubt there's people online who some of their best friends in the world are people who they've never met in person. And they're genuinely friends. I don't doubt that. But I think the danger is when that becomes your whole circle socially.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that there is still a need for actual physical connection and togetherness with people. And so that's a concern that I have just for society. That's something I wonder about. And again, I don't know the future, but we were young adults when smartphones just became ubiquitous. And so we were young enough, and I don't know about you, I feel blessed I didn't have an iPhone when I was in high school. I feel like I would have gotten nothing done. And I really, by the grace of God, that wasn't a thing when I was 16 or 17. But obviously there's lots of research that they design cell phones and they design these popular apps like Facebook and Instagram, to be addictive. I do wonder if there's going to be somewhat of a cultural backlash at some point. And to a degree, obviously there's people who decide to leave social media and just get off of it. Probably for some of the reasons I'm describing, lack of connection, waste of time. And so I do wonder if there's going to be, at some point in the future, a big exodus from some of these social media sites. It's kind of like when we were at Trinity. I feel like a lot of people at Trinity, when they were picking churches, seemed to want churches that were more liturgically structured. Not everybody, but a lot of people like that seemed to be something that they desired. Churches that there was a thoughtful process to how they did worship and why they did worship. And it's not that it mattered, equally to everyone, but to a lot of people, even if for many of them that wasn't even their church background, it was something that resonated with them. And it's something I wonder about, like I said, with social media, if at some point there's just, the younger generation, when they get older, if a lot of them are just going to have this sort of existential crisis where they're like, I lost my childhood to this, and just kind of giving it up or severely cutting back on their consumption.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on that. The first is that I think that's already happening. The question is to what degree and extent it's actually going to be viable and or successful. So viable, I think, is the easiest and shortest to explain. What I mean by that is it's addictive. You have to rewire your brain not to want it. And you have to replace your digital consumption with something else. I'm going to recommend people go on YouTube and find a chapel talk that Reed Schuchart gave from Wheaton College. That's where I went to school. It's a 2009 chapel talk in which he had some witty things to say and very insightful things to say about visual media and attending to God himself and God's word. And he was essentially saying social media is designed and it runs along the same axis of proliferation, or how easy it is to produce media and how short our attention span is becoming. He said, this is your world now. How are you going to sit and listen to a holy God who speaks and doesn't post to YouTube? And it was a very prophetic message. But I think that as Christians, we have to think about that very seriously, if not for all the reasons that we've said with regard to at least America's political divides, but even just from the aspect of this could be a mechanism by which the evil one could be getting more and more Christians distracted and incapable, almost at the biochemical level in their brain, incapable of resisting the temptation to see what someone else has spoken or posted instead of dwelling richly upon God's word. And as pastors, I think that we have to think about that. So that's the viable aspect. So I think wisdom is what Reed Schuchart would say. But I would say even more so now, we have to be wise about consumption. And that's where I'd say there's a question of how successful will we be when, and I actually work in IT, and I worked for a company that had a fruit as its logo. I can tell you without, I signed some NDAs about why they do what they do. Their training is essentially teaching people how to worship. And how they guide people into buying products and using them should be a discipleship manual. That's how good and thoughtful they are about space, about how their apps are designed. That's how in tune they are as designers to how people work, because they play upon the affections. And I can get more into that later. So that's the Bible question. And, then there's the other question of it's happening already. So that's the scale. And so you have the minimalist movement. So people who are getting rid of physical belongings because they want more experiences. And then you also have people who are going more analog. I mean, right as we speak, you have people getting into hobby cars. You have getting people into restoring things. You have people who want to, upcycle, wardrobes or whatnot, and they turn it into like a hobby. Hobbies are huge right now. And if you notice, a lot of them are analog. And I think that's because there's this desire to be tactile, to feel a physical world. And the digital music market has, it wrecked the CD market for a little bit, but what's selling more successfully than anything before in the world? Vinyl LPs. Vinyls come back. People want something physical. Here's the question of scalability. All of these hobbies cost money. They're highly expensive to just about everyone who doesn't have some form of disposable income. After coronavirus and all that it's done to change us economically, will these be will this the ability to enjoy things physically be something that's essentially a luxury? And I think that's just a question worth asking, because vinyl's still expensive. It's $20, $30, an album. And we've got inflation, relatively stagnant wages compared to our inflation rate, and that's before coronavirus. So those are economic questions to ask. But again, how many people can actually enjoy a physical world? So take it for what it is.
Again, that's just very, very thought provoking, and yeah, just the changes that and the shifts that we make in what we value and what we do and how we spend our time and how we spend our money. Yeah, again, I think it's interesting. And a couple more questions.
Sure.
And again, switching back to the inauguration, I like how you put it earlier about hopefulness. I'd be curious, in the next administration, what's the thing that makes you most optimistic, and the thing that to you is most concerning? And I guess it doesn't even necessarily have to be about the administration itself, but just the world and where you see it going over the next few years.
I really don't see anything particularly hopeful with regard to American politics. And I think I should qualify that, because I think what always gives me hope, and this is just me personally, is that with every passing day, it's one day closer to Jesus coming. And I think that's just wonderful. And then there's the realist part of me, and the part of me that likes studying history and patterns and whatnot, that says, well, this isn't looking too good. And I think that I'd be, so for me, with regard to whichever administration was going to take over, it doesn't really matter to me. I think that there's a normalcy bias that says, if only my candidate would have won, things will return to normal, whatever normal is. We've been long upon this trajectory that really isn't the best trajectory from a historical lens, from our spending to the increasing verbal to economic hostility between ideas or ideologies along the political spectrum. So again, that's the moving of people geographically to the moving of people with regard to digital space, to the denying of services, and that's including banking, social media access, and whatnot for certain ideologies. That to me, from just a realistic standpoint, it's not going to be Civil War II with armies lining up against each other. It's going to be probably more sectarian, with spats of political violence. And this is just my prediction. I think things really take a turn. I could be wrong. I'm not, but it looks more like sectarian violence that comes up here and there, brawls in streets. But that's actually kind of normative for American history. The fact that we've had since the end of World War II to present, and it's been relatively calm, because there actually was quite a bit of violence. We've had it pretty good for a couple of decades, including the economic growth. But if I'm being a realist about it, all empires come to an end. It's just how they go out. And I think as a Christian, you should be okay with that. Our hope in the Lord is not coterminous with the prosperity of our current, location as far as the nation state. Although I definitely have my preferences. I love a good nation state for its function. I love, due process under the law. I love the Bill of Rights. It's a wonderful document. Was it written by perfect people? No. Do I think that there are some really bad tendencies to anachronistically look at historical figures and throw out the baby with the bathwater? Absolutely. You know, is there a difference between saying, here's a historical context with a present circumstance, with a present outworking for a circumstance, to the whole thing's bunk? Absolutely. And I think we're more in the era in which I'm not saying pure dystopia, but we're living in this strange trifecta of Orwell, Aldous Huxley, and the guy who wrote Fahrenheit 451. So what I mean by that is, you have your big brother, the all-seeing eye, if you will, the one who sees and watches everything, your social media, and that just shocks people into shame and silence, always watching. You know, there's that feeling of always being watched, and like government's always getting bigger, whether right or wrong. That's the feeling. But then you have this lulling into apathy or complacency by social media, making you feel good about yourself, which is kind of like Soma. We're hedonistic to our core. As long as I'm getting my comeuppance, as long as I put food on my table, as long as I'm hedonistically satisfied in my earthly desires. And Aldous Huxley in his Brave New World, people were popping pills or participating in orgies, and that's how they were controlled. As long as you can make people happy and hedonistically satisfied, they were controllable. And that's essentially being watched, being perpetually entertained or amused to being distracted, and then you burn history. That's your Fahrenheit 451. So I think that there's a strange intersection of all three dystopians, and yet it's not as dark or dreary as an Orwell's 1984. It's not oppression by the whip, if you will. It's control by helping people forget Fahrenheit 451, erasing history, as well as making them just so entertained that they don't know what's changing beneath their feet. So a perpetually distracted and ever reacting society, and not really a thinking one. So that's where I'm I'm more of a pessimist because of at least what I've seen, or what I'm prone to see in history. Because I'll admit I might have my own biases or leanings as far as what I want to see. But you know what? I think that God can do amazing work, and that brings us to a place where the church can show why evil is truly evil. That makes the gospel more compelling. And so what I mean by that is there's a certain type of apologetic in which you can show how evil and wretched life is and how terrible life is without God. And that is a compelling argument for many. And in a world where more people are scared, I think we would do well to show people, yeah, this is a scary time. But if we can show up and we can not run away and be hopeful in the Lord, and for good reason, I think the Lord can do some very powerful things. And so I jokingly said to you one day, I think it's time for revival. Like, we at least America's been long overdue for another great awakening. Why not now? I don't want to put the box around the Lord. So I think if there's a time to pray and lament over what we have become as a people or as a nation state, if that's still a thing worth calling a community, now is as good a time as any, I suppose.
That's I think a great word to close on, and yeah, I would absolutely agree, and I pray for revival in our nation with everything that we're facing right now. Dan, I feel like we just scratched the surface on so many interesting subjects. I truly appreciate your time, and I'd love to talk to you again sometime on this podcast, because I always appreciate your insights into the end of the world, and but it's so great to talk to you today.
Well, absolutely. I'd love to talk to you more, Josh. It's always a pleasure when we do.
Thank you.